Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Scandal Mongers Podcast. With me, Phil Craig, at the Australian bar. I'm still getting into a little routine here. Me and the bar. What's on the bar, you say? Well, something quite interesting. Hang on. Now, I may have mentioned a few times, the penchant we have, that's a sophisticated French word for being really greedy, a penchant we have here in the Craig family for cocktails at the Australian bar. Now, Mrs. Craig, I've mentioned, she loves Manhattan. You might even see a bottle of red vermouth. But this is a key element to a Manhattan Angostura bitters. Other bitters are available. Also, Angostura bitters, you could sponsor this podcast. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Anyway, you use like a tiny drop of this in each drink. I think this is the third bottle we've bought this decade. So we're going through it at a fair clip. I could probably calculate how many Manhattans Mrs. Craig has drunk based on the size of this bottle, but that would be just sad. But anyway, a new addition to the bar. Might be having some of that later. We often, when we have, I mentioned we're in a choir, we come back from choir practice about 9 o'clock. So we could just have a nice sober day, or I could make you a Manhattan. And guess what she usually says? And that's when the cheese comes out. Oh dear, not good. Not good for the Craig diet, but a lot of fun. Talking of lots of fun, loads of you loved Helen. I mean, a really good response and a good audience numbers. I was very pleased to see the number of people who watched Helen Fry last week. And of course, it was my anniversary, 2 years. Tracy John, 826, enjoyed the program and said, "Happy anniversary, Scandal Mongers. Way to go, Phil. Thank you for your podcast so much. I now know what my monthly audiobook pick will be again because of this great podcast. You're delivering value." Isn't that lovely? Yeah, well, I hope Helen sold a few books because she's terrific. And if you haven't seen her, she talks with such passion about storytelling, about the importance of using archives to tell stories of people who we don't normally hear about. In her case, women in the wars of the 20th century. Terrific person, a lovely interview. And you learn a lot. But of course, many of you just wanted to know about cocktails. Liz Altieri enjoyed learning about the furnace that I spoke about. Another of our family treats, and she's recommended the sidecar, which, I know it's quite famous. I don't think we've ever tried it. Anyway, Liz has given us a recipe, so we might be trying it soon. Equal parts gin, good dry London gin. Nothing else will do. You don't want to overwhelm the drink. So your gin, Cointreau, no cheap triple sec, she says, and lemon juice. Sidecar. Sounds nice. Susan Marg wasn't talking about drinks. She liked the show. She liked Helen. Absolute cracker, Phil. Helen's general knowledge is good for several more episodes, and she's fun, funny, and smart. Oh, and you are too, Phil. Oh, that's nice. Yes, we all love the validation in YouTube land. Catherine Anderson, 3348. What a great episode. Helen Fry presented some excellent information. And I want to thank you, Phil, for your comments on the American election. Being an American and a Democrat, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, that was really reassuring. And a lot of you actually said, we don't mind your rants, Phil, because we can always skip them. And I wanted to talk a bit about, things that we've mentioned on the podcast, some of the stories, how it connects to world affairs and especially the American election. And my thoughts about maybe where the left's going a bit wrong. Quite a few of you who would probably call yourself on the left agreed with me. Some of you didn't, but that's what this is all about, the engagement, the conversation, sharing ideas. I like talking about them. Some of you like listening. It works. Now, this week, I've mentioned in the bio Prince Andrew, but I actually also want to talk about the Archbishop of Canterbury. The two stories are kind of related, big stories of the week. And they're both, I guess, about the consequences of abuse and bad behavior at the top of British society and how people cling on. And it's very hard maybe to make them accountable. We've touched upon this many times on this podcast. In Prince Andrew's case, he's clearly he's found a new patron. Now, my dear friend Andrew Loney is working away on his book, and he's promised to talk about this when the book's ready. And I know he's already got some thoughts about how Andrew gets his hands on money. But just to rewind a little, the story of the week about him is that he's hanging on to the Royal Lodge. This is beautiful big mansion in Windsor Great Park that he's had. The Queen Mother used to live there. Now, it's been well known for a while that King Charles would like him out, and apparently has cut funding. Whatever funding Andrew got from Charles has gone. Andrew has his own money, of course. None of these people are poor. But the Royal Lodge is a big thing, and he's obligated, I think, to upkeep various, expensive paintings, the security costs. Keeping the place running is not cheap, and some various photos have emerged of, mouldy old walls and crumbling this and rather decrepit that. I know maybe that's a metaphor for the royal family or a metaphor for Andrew. I don't know, but it's obviously there are issues about whether he can afford to keep it up. But he says he can. And this has come out through the various ways these stories come out through sources and friends. He's found a benefactor. But this benefactor is anonymous. Who is it? Nobody knows. Should we know? Well, I think we probably should. Because as Andrew Loney has said, and we've talked about before on the podcast, most people think about Andrew and scandal. They think about what happened with Epstein. But parallel to that was his work as a trade envoy and the various deals that were done and the friends that he made and the favors that he pulled, and the suggestion, certainly Andrew Loney's made the suggestion that some of these friends have helped him financially and helped Fergie, Sarah, who's also living in the lodge, part-time, I believe, with him now. The closest divorced couple in history. So is it somebody to do with the trade missions and that side of his life who's now putting money, taking money from their pocket and giving it to Andrew so he can stay in the life to which he has become accustomed? Well, we don't know. But this story is not going away. And there's some really interesting insights came out. There's a couple of pieces in the British tabloids, seem very well sourced, about the sort of reclusive existence Andrew has. Him and Fergie, they spend their time watching television, maybe going for the odd ride. He plays golf with his old buddies. But really, he doesn't have a role, except to cling on to what he once had and to try and leverage whatever friends he still has left so he can cling on to it. And it's kind of sad and kind of tragic, really. There are other people in the world we should feel more sorry for. I don't really feel sorry for Andrew at all, to be honest. But the situation is, I don't know, it slightly appeals to the sentimental in me, I guess. Now, somebody who has also been, exposed, I guess is the wrong word. This has been a story that's been around for a long time. But finally, unlike Andrew, somebody has been at the top of the British establishment. It's been held to account this week, and that's the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is another case connected to abuse that happened in the past, in this case, the distant past. Not abuse that anybody says was carried out by this man, Justin Welby, the Archbishop. But the suggestion is he didn't do enough to act on it. He was very incurious, is the word that was used in an official report, a report he commissioned. I'll backtrack because it's a story many of you won't know, and it's really shocking. It really goes back to a terrible man called John Smith, who was a big figure in the church, in the church's educational establishment, and a particular part of the church that was tasked to train up the future leaders of the Church of England, which of course is an international church, the Anglican Church, and the Archbishop is in charge of churches all over the world. And some of these supposed offences took place outside Britain, but it started in Britain, and he seems to have had a kind of strange sadomasochistic, or maybe just sado, obsessions, fetish with beating boys. This is not unheard of. And he was, there's some awful stories. I won't read all the quote I've got in front of me because it would be probably banned on this platform. It's rather explicit. But some boys, thousands of times, thousands of strokes of the cane, beaten till they bled, taken into rooms that were soundproofed. Just a reign of terror over these boys. And clearly it's something that he based a large part of his life around, an obsession, with a distinctly dark sort of sexual twist to it, of enjoying, dominating and inflicting pain upon the young people he was meant to be educating. It's gross. And it was known about. You can't keep these things secret. But again, going back to some of the stories we've covered, Savile, so many others, Fayed now it seems, nothing is done. Powerful people get away with it. In the church, and a lot of this has come out just in the last couple of weeks, people didn't know. He was moved. He was offshored to Africa. Get that? They said, oh, we're sending to Africa, where, of course, he continued. More boys were beaten and abused, and one of them apparently died in very mysterious circumstances. And this scandal involved elite leaders of the church, very senior people, and indeed Welby. Now, Welby, it's now known that he was aware of what this man was doing. He wasn't particularly powerful back in the 80s or 90s, but he knew the man. Exchanged cards, Christmas cards, Christian Christmas cards with this bloke. Anyway, later, of course, he becomes Archbishop. And then things get really serious because it's definitely proven now in this review that was published, which he himself, Welby, commissioned, that he did very little. And from 2013 onwards, the allegations were formally brought to him and nothing much was done. A distinct lack of curiosity. Now, there's a phrase that we should use in this program, maybe more in the future, because it really does sum up, I think, what the high reaches of the establishment sometimes their default, especially if you're one of us. And Welby was very much one of us. Eton, Trinity College, Cambridge, the absolute top rank of the British establishment. And yet here's all these floods of reports about, and others, all sorts of paedophiles have been exposed, as has been in the Catholic Church, as in many religious organizations. Welby was very incurious. Finally, he under pressure, he commissions this report. This report is very damning of him. Lots of people step up, including many of his own vicars. Eventually, he has to go. But a side of this story that really I thought was very shocking, actually, was the reaction of some of the other figures in, you might call, the great and the good of Britain to the news of his resignation, because there's quite a lot of sympathy for this man. And I said earlier that some of us might feel some sympathy for Andrew, even though we probably shouldn't. But I think in the case of the Archbishop, we definitely shouldn't. I mean, he was banged to rights on this, and he probably should have gone a long time ago. And yet there's a couple of people, many people stepped up to say, oh, isn't this sad, poor him, he did his best. Well, he didn't do his best. He didn't do his job. And two of the people that spoke out are two of our most famous and much-loved podcasters. I'm sure you'll know who they are. The Rest is Politics. It's huge. These people, they fill the Albert Hall with their adoring fans. My booking for the Albert Hall has been cancelled, by the way. 7 people wasn't enough. But, a boy can dream. But they do fill the Albert Hall. They are very influential. And they're very entertaining. We're talking about Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Now, Rory is another example of the establishment par excellence, Eton and Cambridge. And actually, I'm not sure about Cambridge. Certainly Eton. I don't know whether he knew Welby. He's probably a bit younger than Welby. But his instinctive response was to kind of rush to this man's defence and say, well, he was good, he was moral, he was decent. And I think it's because he was one of them. And our instinct, and this does go back to what we spoke about last week, the instinct that if you're on our side, then you're kind of forgivable. And, our default will be to see things from your point of view. You're part of the team. You have the right opinions. Sort of opinions on most things that Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart would probably have on their podcast. And for actually to hear Campbell speaking about this was particularly confronting. It's astonishing to me how he's become so popular. He was known a decade ago as the man that helped lead Britain and the West into a disastrous war in Iraq by, well, got to pick your words carefully when Alistair's concerned, but overemphasizing certain aspects of intelligence to do with weapons of mass destruction, shall we say. He's always said he was wrong. It was a mistake, not any kind of intentional spin. But a lot of people don't believe him. And he was certainly somebody who was widely disliked. But he's come back, and he's now very popular. And he uses his platform in this case to find kind words for the Archbishop when he's been exposed in this terrible scandal. And it did make me think about groupthink and all the things we spoke about last week about the left. I'm not sure I'd call Rory Stewart the left, the centre left, establishment left. Bien pensant, I think is the word we often use, good thinkers. And And it was, in response to this, actually, J.K. Rowling wrote something I thought was really interesting, saying principles are not dictated or shouldn't be by other people's approval. I am not in this, she's talking about her campaigning. I am not in this to feel part of a team. I just thought that was really interesting because so many people are, I think. My team's lost. I'm leaving Twitter because my team's lost. I'm joining this other platform. By the way, I'm joining both because I got a book to sell. But there's a lot of that at the moment, don't you think? Teams, groupthink. Yeah, you can't, we're not open-minded anymore about this story. I like the guy, but he's done something wrong. I generally agree with that party, but they're wrong about this. We don't hear enough of that. And it's something that I will no doubt will return to again. It seems to inform pretty much all the really big stories that dominate our news at the moment. And it's something that we all need to think about a lot more now. I haven't even mentioned Churchill. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning. I'm sure you know from the bio, the main purpose of this program is to continue. You can continue to indulge me in my fascination with the Second World War and with Churchill. We've had so many stories about him, the good and the bad. We had the stories about some of Churchill's scandals and his failings and the things he got wrong in his life, and there are many of those. And we've had lots of stories as well about the extraordinary things he did, certainly in the early years of the Second World War. And the book I'm writing, actually, at the moment deals with the end of the Second World War. And, the jury's a little bit more out on that. But certainly in 1940, oh my God, still revere the man. But he was most unusual. He would never have thrived in the political culture of today. Oh, my goodness, he would be out. But he would never have got in. He was just so very, very odd in his opinion, in his manner, in his behavior, and in his choice of friends. And that's what this podcast interview will be about today. Adrian Phillips has written a good book, Winston's Bandits. And it really reminds us, I think, that when Churchill did finally come to power, an awful lot of people thought, well, we're in trouble. This is the last throw of the dice. We finally turned to Winston to be PM. It's been the dream of his life, but oh my God, it's a gamble. Because he was known to be a maverick himself, capable of massive errors of judgment. And somebody who took advice from really fringe people. I mean, I suppose you might say there's a certain reminiscence about Trump and Musk in all this, bringing in people who are considered a little bit balmy, like, maybe the new Kennedy, who's going to be the guru of the health service in America, the national health leader. Some of the things he said, I think, are a little bit peculiar. But Churchill was attracted to men like that. Even though they were often wrong, sometimes they were right, and you needed to be open to all opinions. But it was a really important part of his makeup, and nobody before this book has really looked at Churchill through this lens of his friends, which is why I think it's a really interesting read, why I recommend it to you, and I hope you enjoy the interview that's coming up now with Adrian. Thank you very much for listening to me. More cocktail recipes incoming next week. See you at the end of the interview. Bye. Adrian, thank you so much for joining me to talk about one of my favourite people. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Great pleasure.
I mean, I was looking at some of the reviews. There's loads of books on Churchill. I'm sure you've read a lot. I've read a lot. I've even written about him myself before. But this is a really original way, and I think a really clever way of getting into his character. And also the colour of the kind of friendships, the feuds, the infighting, the backbiting, the epic feats of drinking that went on. What made you want to do this book?
What strikes you about Churchill as a kind of world historical figure, which he is that he's obviously human. There is a warm, vibrant, individual human dimension to him, which one struggles to find in other figures of the same stature. That's the starting point. And obviously, who your friends are, how you deal with them, is part of that human angle. And once I got into the work, it was really fascinating to see who he chose as his friends, who chose him as their friend, and how those friendships played out. And go out on a limb and say you can't properly understand Churchill unless you look at that side of him.
No, I would agree with you. And I think you're right. He is very human, very open with his feelings, and intensely strange and odd. I mean, it's hard to imagine a man like that in high office today. I think you mentioned the Order of the Bath. Some of these friends had the privilege of sitting in his bathroom watching him have a bath when he wanted to talk to them. I mean, can you imagine that happening now in the White House or Number 10? I mean, there'd be a
Well,
public inquiry.
yeah, and secretaries were assigned to take dictation the other side of the bathroom door with water lapping under it.
No, and it's lovely to get into that world with you. And it's also really warts and all book. I mean, a lot of these friends are a little bit dodgy. That was always one of the things people said about Churchill, his enemies, that he attracted kind of eccentric, maverick people to him. But he also seemed to draw things from them that he probably wouldn't have got by going the more establishment route.
They all provided him with something that he needed. Uh, Bracken was actually prepared to argue with him. Churchill sometimes is accused of being bully and domineering. Yes, he was hard-nosed, he was prepared to challenge people brutally, but he didn't mind being challenged back. It's very rare that you can actually find instances where Churchill resents criticism, and that's usually when he's actually done something wrong and is being reminded of it. Otherwise, he is perfectly happy to be fought. That, say, was one of the big strengths of Brendan Bracken. They would argue like man and wife. A couple of sources repeat that phrase. They would have screaming matches, but that didn't affect their friendship. Churchill wanted that. He needed it in his life.
Did he have any close female friends? I mean, everybody you write about is a man around the same age as him. Did he ever let women get that close to him? Obviously, Clemmy was perhaps his most important confidant, but were there any other women that he would have considered really intimate friends?
I think Clemmy, to begin with, is very important because political wives of that era simply do not move the needle. And they are completely background figures. Whilst Clemmy was very much a foreground figure in Winston's life. And again, you have the same dynamic. He was perfectly happy to be challenged, he was perfectly happy to be fought. And Clemmy, unlike the kind of geishas that you were accustomed to, was prepared to take on Winston himself, notably in terms of his friends. And she thoroughly disapproved of what she referred to as the terrible bees. Beaverbrook, Bracken, and Birkenhead, who had died by 1930, and possibly Boothby as well. And Bracken, she was one round to, but the others never really. And I think she really detested Beaverbrook.
No, you quote a great letter, which I cut and pasted into my notes. I thought it was wonderful. Dear, my darling, she says to Churchill when writing of Beaverbrook, do try ridding yourself of this microbe, which some people fear is in your blood. Exorcise this bottle imp and see if the air is not clearer and purer. Isn't that amazing?
I cannot but agree with Clemmy. I'm afraid to say Beaverbrook is a figure who I didn't particularly like to begin with, and my attitude to him has continued to go down.
Well, I was going to ask you who your least favourite friend was, but I think it's pretty obvious from your book it's Beaverbrook.
Oh, certainly. He was a man who was very disliked in his lifetime. Um, I actually struggle to find a single positive thing he did. And the other dimension to Beaverbrook, which is important, is it was an outgrowth of his huge capacity for hatred, is that he was deeply feared, even in his family.
No, he had a great capacity for feuding. And it's interesting because I've written about 1940. And one of the things that used to be said about Beaverbrook is, well, he bashed heads together and he shouted and slammed doors, but he got things done and he helped boost aircraft production at a critical time. But actually, you make a good case that he slightly steals the credit of other men for that.
I think the best you can credit him with is a 20% increase in fighter production. And even then, a lot of the work had been done before, and a lot was simple governmental decision to allocate priorities to fighter production. Otherwise, he was very good at stealing the credit. Um, One of the things I go into in the book is how he got one of his rather horrible toadies to write up his achievements. And also, interestingly, he put the most outrageous fabrications to Churchill himself, which Churchill never challenged. I mean, twice a few months apart, Beaverbrook says to him, when you came into office, there were only a handfuls of Hurricanes and Spitfires. That is utter nonsense. There were some hundreds of them. But Beaverbrook thought he could get away with it, and Churchill never seems to have challenged him on it.
Why was he so loyal to Beaverbrook? Is that because he was one of his few really big supporters during the so-called wilderness years?
Quite the opposite. They fell out during the wilderness years. Beaverbrook was decidedly hostile to him. And I think this shows another very important trait of Churchill, that he would tolerate dissent and he would forgive and forget.
Hmm. Well, he does a lot of that, doesn't he? In 1940, when he comes into power, and as you say in the book, and there's a lot of scepticism amongst the Conservative Party and the civil servants. Jock Colville's often quoted. He becomes a great fan of Churchill, but at the end, at the beginning, in May and June, he's very suspicious of this man with his colourful reputation for getting things, for chasing lost causes, getting things wrong, and all his terrible, loud, drunken friends who keep turning up. And that's, I guess, the impression many people had.
And it goes beyond that to the other bandits. We have Alec Dunglass, later Alec Douglas Hume, talking about, in 1940, the scum surrounding Winston. No, I think it went more than ordinary suspicion. He was deeply reviled.
But I suppose that, because I'm second to none in admiring what he achieved, especially in that year. But of course, if you looked over his whole career, there are as many disasters, you might argue, as successes. And of course, in the 30s, he championed the king during the abdication crisis, which was probably certainly the wrong thing to do, and perhaps most sort of controversially, especially today, he'd really tried his best to stop India getting any kind of independence or self-government or dominion status, which made him look like a terrible old reactionary even then.
That was his biggest error. Less for his public image, because I don't think that the whole India Bill debate resonated at all with the British electorate, but certainly in terms of the Conservative Party and the government, because it was an outright challenge to government policy. It was sort of the Brexit debate of its day, and he did himself untold harm. And he didn't even make himself any friends, because most of the India diehards segued naturally into becoming ferocious appeasers. So that was
he did forgive. He took a lot of his former enemies into his government. He worked with people like Halifax and Chamberlain in those critical months.
He is was a supreme pragmatist. He was somebody very capable of making a simple decision and sticking by it. Though in 1940, he knew that he needed both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party on his side. So even though he knew he was disliked amongst the Conservatives, and because he still detested socialism, he knew that in order to construct a proper national government to fight the war, he would just, in the naval phrase, have to clench his teeth and hold back the big bits. So when Beaverbrook has his series of toe-to-toes with Ernie Bevin over organising the labour market, as Minister of Aircraft Production, then as Minister of Supply, Churchill comes down in favour of Bevin. Churchill is not going to destroy his coalition with the Labour Party, even though it means offending Beaverbrook, who otherwise is extraordinarily tolerant towards.
Okay, so we know Beaverbrook is your least favourite friend. Who was your most favourite? Who was the one you liked and warmed to as you researched him?
Bracken, because he was fun. He was a bit of a nutter.
Yes, I thought you might have said Lindemann from reading your book. He's not particularly a warm character, but he seems to get an awful lot done, and he's very kind of well, he seems to place himself at the heart of everything to do with science and statistics.
He was vital to Churchill's war effort. He was Churchill's guide through the thickets of Whitehall, not because Lindemann knew them, but because he could be utterly brutal and was absolutely like a Rottweiler when he was looking for facts and information for Churchill. And it was the days, of course, before people talked about the blob, but Lindemann was Churchill's anti-blob man.
Yeah, he's the Dominic
So
Cummings, perhaps, of the story.
I think sure, Lindemann made enemies, but not quite with the enthusiasm of Cummings.
Okay,
But Lindemann did make enemies. He was a man who had no desire whatever to be loved. Conciliation
I do
was
love
just
your
not
story
part.
about it when Churchill used to just turn to him sort of randomly and ask him odd questions. Like one day he wanted him to calculate the volume of champagne I have drunken in my life up to this day. And I think you say
Absolutely,
Churchill was
he was
quite
just
disappointed. It was only a railway carriage worth or something.
And also it took Lindemann a while to calculate that. And by the same token, when some South American leader sent him a gift of cigars and there was a momentary suspicion maybe they're poisoned or explosive, Lindemann was the go-to man to ask the question. He was the one who was at Churchill's side throughout the war. Bracken had the Ministry of Information to run from 1941 onwards. So, to a great extent, it was Lindemann's war as well as it was Churchill's.
Wow. I mean, I've read a lot of Alan Brooke's diaries. You probably have as well. I mean, he would never be called a friend of Churchill. He was never rather disapproved of the sort of late night brainstorms and the drinking. But his assessment, I think, of the men around him is quite interesting too, because I think he felt that he took the pressure off the generals, that he had these people to vent to.
The other comment from another general whose name will come back to me in a moment is that yes, they were there. Yes, they were gadflies. Yes, they were often bad influences, but the machine itself was robust enough to cope. And the incarnation of that is Hastings Ismay, who Churchill inherited from the old regime, had no real idea about, but he was the perfect individual. Churchill appointed himself Minister of Defence without really knowing what that was going to involve. And there was Ismay, who'd actually been a shadow Minister of Defence since 1938. And they worked perfectly together. Ismay was a vital figure in the war effort, not a bandit because he wasn't a friend of Churchill, and also he detested Lindemann. Read his memoirs, and there is about a page and a half about how he hates Lindemann. It is very revealing. It's possibly the most negative thing that I've read about Lindemann, and there's a fair amount of negative stuff that's been written about him.
Well, yeah, with Churchill at the centre of this group, there's quite a lot of warfare between and betwixt, which is quite fun. There's lots of that in your book. It's very colourful. That they're always sort of they've got an ability to wage vendettas, and it all sort of goes over Churchill's head somewhat, because I guess he feels he's getting the best of them and their passion.
Yes, again, in terms of showing Churchill's character, what you realise, this is not a dimension to him that's often touched on, is he was a good compartmentalizer. And in fact, some of the bandits seem to have had zero contact with each other. Um, and as you said, they did, though, in some cases, fight each other. I think the most epic battle was Beaverbrook versus Lindeman. Neither a man who had any worries about upsetting other people or making enemies, and they were firm enemies. But a point came, in fact, when Churchill had to choose, when he couldn't let it wash over him, and he came down on Lindeman's side. That is I would say, possibly the biggest scoop of the book.
What was this? What was the subject of this dispute?
Uh, Ultimately, it was a turf fight. Um, and ultimately, it showed Lindeman pulling the Beaverbrook trick of resigning or threatening to resign, which Beaverbrook certainly overplayed like nobody's business. When push turned to shove, Lindeman actually said, "This is it."
Well, it's lovely to talk about the Second World War and 1940 and those heroic times. But there's lots of really interesting stuff about the younger Churchill and his struggles in the First World War, when David Lloyd George comes in, and I found that quite interesting. He comes across as quite a vulnerable man at that time, Churchill. Maybe it was the experience of Gallipoli had made him a little bit less ebullient. Is that fair?
Absolutely. No, he had been on a fantastic political trajectory. He'd achieved so much. He looked so well placed. And his early days as First Lord of the Admiralty, he was doing fantastically well. Then it all went wrong over Gallipoli, and it crystallized pretty extensive dislike of him in the Conservative Party, from whom he had defected. Um, and as he is trying to work his way back into government, this is his first substantial contact with Beaverbrook. And I think it's quite important in terms of the dynamic of their relationship, is that in those days, it was Beaverbrook who was the powerful figure, because he was the man who had Andrew Bonar Law's ear. And without getting Bonar Law on side, Churchill was not getting back into government. So at that point, Churchill was very much the junior partner in the relationship.
Yeah, we do forget that he. I guess.
Have I lost you there?
Oh, I can hear you, but I can't see you moving. I think your camera's frozen. Can you hear me still?
Likewise here. Your picture is frozen.
Oh right. Well, I think maybe the thing's recording us, and our beautifully judged words will be recorded for posterity. So let's keep going. Nobody expects.
Okay, I can see you again now.
No, I was just going to say that period of his life, at the end of the First World War in the 20s, when he was in and out of office and changing parties left, right, and centre. Was there ever a time when he lost that sort of natural confidence and ebullience, and his kind of circle of friends kind of say, "Oh, keep going, Winston. You are a man of destiny," or was he always just so self-assured it didn't matter?
For me, the relevant feature of the early mid-20s is he developed a strong life outside of politics. His family comes along. He starts building Chartwell very much as a projection of his personality, and also centre of his dynastic ambitions, because the idea was that Chartwell will be passed on to Randolph. He begins to paint. He begins to lay bricks. Um, he finds resources outside a political career which isn't going so well. Um, and that certainly helps see him through. And all of those elements stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was able to find solace and refreshment in painting. Um, Again, the relationship with Clemmy was a very important part of his life, and the children were were very important. The sad thing is that Randolph was such a disappointment, but indirectly, his son-in-law, Edwin Duncan Sands, was really the missing man from the team of bandits. Because when you look through the parliamentary battles over appeasement, Sands is a much more important figure than he's perhaps given credit for.
Well, I wanted to
He
talk to you about
thought,
appeasement because we mentioned some of the causes that he took up. In hindsight, looked like he'd made the wrong call. But of course, the big thing he got right at a time when so many people were not getting it right, was seeing the danger that was coming from Europe and calling for rearmament. And actually, I think we don't read much today about just how nasty that was for him personally, and how the most of the Tory party kind of tried to really rip him apart. And I guess the bandits, the Friends, must have been very important then.
Yeah, there are two legs to it. I mean, first of all, there's rearmament, and don't forget that rearmament was officially the government's policy. It was not a rerun of India, where he was directly challenging the government. He was criticizing the government over the scale and effectiveness of rearmament. There's a wonderful phrase that he uses to describe one of the early rearmament budgets for the Royal Air Force. He described it as tiny, timid, tentative, and hardy. So he was pushing for greater effectiveness. This is where Lindemann was very important because Churchill was also against the absolute mantra that the bomber will always get through. Churchill knew instinctively that this was a fallacy. Lindemann knew with greater authority that it was a fallacy. And that fed their campaign. The actual details were possibly not right. I mean, who remembers aerial mines these days? But that was right and wrong. That part of the campaign took ordinary political nous and courage. What took real moral fortitude was when we segued into Chamberlain's version of appeasement, which was, in today's jargon, to try for constructive dialogue with the dictators, and which was, with hindsight, utterly the wrong approach, which led to Munich, which led to possibly the bravest thing that anybody could have done, which was to remain seated when Chamberlain entered the House of Commons after the Munich Agreement.
That's a very bitter debate, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people are rolling their eyes, to say the least, at what Churchill is saying. Come on, we can't just endlessly fight wars. And he is portrayed as a kind of sort of slightly drunken, romantic warmonger. And, people didn't want to fight wars. Of course they didn't. We had the Great War and the ruinous cost of that. And he was widely portrayed as a fanatic at that point, as you pointed out.
There's one comment from him by the then Liberal leader when he's arguing for rearmament, who says, "This is the language of a Malay running amok."
Yeah.
And everybody was very seriously anti-war. There was an utter horror at the thought of having war again. So Chamberlain and the other appeasers were absolutely fully in line with public sentiment. Where Churchill was out on a limb was that he was in effect saying, we have to take the risk.
Mm.
And it's perhaps a dimension of Chamberlain's appeasement, which is rather neglected, which I rather put down to his right-hand man, Sir Horace Wilson, which was the extreme risk aversion of appeasement, the belief that above all we mustn't do anything to upset Hitler.
Mm.
Which, when you unpick what was going on in the campaign against Churchill that was being waged openly and more behind the scenes by Chamberlain, was very much the leitmotif that fair to say, to argue we ought to try for dialogue with Hitler. That was not irrational at the time. That was chimed perfectly well with people's sentiment. But what was both a tactical error, looked humiliating at the time, and is now shameful, is this obsession with not upsetting Hitler.
Mm. And who of the bandits, you said probably the son-in-law, Duncan, he was the most important to Churchill at this time, the late 30s?
Yes, he was, he was in Parliament. Lindemann had tried to get into Parliament, but perhaps fortunately had failed. I don't think he would have been a very effective parliamentarian. So Duncan Sandys rather took over from what Bracken had done in the fight against the India Bill and the fight against appeasement. Boothby comes back in after being rather estranged from Churchill during the early 30s. He certainly is an anti-appeaser out of conviction. He's probably rather more ambiguous towards Churchill as an individual, but there weren't a lot of people prepared to take that risk. So Booth becomes almost a bandit by default at that stage.
Well, I was saving Boothby
say,
up. I was saving Bob Boothby till the end. We did a whole program on him a few months ago, more about his scandalous relationships in the 60s with the Crays, a story you allude to. But when he was a friend of Churchill's, was any of that part of his makeup? You know, was he running around with little East End gangsters at the time?
Not that quite that extreme, but his affair with Dorothy Macmillan, Harold Macmillan's wife, was very widely known. And even by the fairly loose standards of upper class behavior in those days, was considered debatable. Also, it was another, I won't say nail in the coffin, but it was another factor that meant that the anti-appeasers stayed divided. You had the small Churchill group, which was at most two or three other MPs. You had the Eden group, which was rather more substantial. You had Macmillan, who was pretty much out on his own, and you had a clutch of individuals um, who were completely free agents. So yes, there was a Churchill group opposing appeasement, but it was not part of any kind of wider or larger movement.
So scandalous men like Boothby, Churchill doesn't seem to be particularly judgmental about other people's personal behaviour, does he? I mean, he was not a moralist.
Absolutely not. Going back to the abdication, which was his other great era of the 1930s, his wilderness years, is his comment about Wallace Simpson, who he described as the king's cutie, and he saw no objection to Edward marrying his cutie, which Noel cowered Cap by saying, don't think we're quite ready for a queen, cutie.
Yes, well, they were a sort of loose, loose, but maybe was the word that people would have, a loose circle with loose morals. But there were
Absolutely.
lots of those in the
Though,
British upper classes, and they always have been.
yes, though one of the intriguing aspects of the senior bandits is that Lindemann and Bracken were, as far as one can tell, celibate
Really.
in those days.
Well,
Sherwood
Beaverbrook
had
wasn't.
been. Say again? Oh, most
Beaverbrook
certainly
wasn't.
not. Very, very much not. Um,
And Churchill himself, I've never read anything in all the books, a suggestion that he was involved with any women other than Clemmy, which for a senior politician of that time is actually quite rare.
yes. He was certainly close to Doris Castleross, who was a very big ticket courtesan during a period when his relationship with Clemmy was fairly strained. Just how close they are is endlessly debated. But in practice, he was monogamous and he did depend on Clemmy. So,
Yeah, and as to return to the beginning, he seemed to prefer male company. I mean, obviously, he was very close to his daughters and his wife, but for sort of relaxation and brainstorming and drinking, he did tend to prefer the company of men about his own age, didn't he?
a lot of that would have been simply the way life was in those days.
Fair enough.
We were still retiring or the ladies were still retiring to leave the men to their port. And
That's true, and there were very few female politicians. I mean, a
yeah,
handful.
or female heavy hitters in the civil service or anything. Um, I would guess that wind forward 30 years, and there would have been a far greater feminine presence in Churchill's life. I don't think he suffered for excluded people out of prejudice in any way. It's just that because the mechanisms of society in those days were again it just didn't happen.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I want to ask you a question I always ask anybody who writes biographies. At the end of the process of doing all this work, did you change your views of Churchill? Did you like him more, like him less? What did you think of him at the end?
I admired him more. Again, picking up the question of pragmatism, that was an outgrowth of one thing which comes through very, very clearly, which is that Churchill was a guy who would seize on an essential and generally would come up with the right conclusion and understand that it was important to follow that through. It was a very antithesis of the Rab Butler politics is the art of the possible mentality. For Churchill, some things were important, and that was what mattered. And going beyond that, or executing that philosophy, he was prepared to sacrifice old prejudices, to forego old enmities. And I think that is one of the things that makes him a great man.
Well, what a good place to end. I know we've been freezing in each other's frames throughout this conversation, but I'm pretty confident that our beautiful words have been recorded. So thank you for sharing yours.
A great pleasure.
And for writing this terrific book, which I recommend to anybody watching.
Absolutely, which I shamefully will
wave it about. I always do. Thanks
plug.
A lot, Adrian.
A pleasure.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, there you are. Back at the bar. The Angostura Bitters is in its proper place, waiting with his evening. All's well with the world. I hope you enjoyed Adrian as much as I did. Can't get enough of Churchill. Can't get enough of World War II. And I hope the book buying public agrees with me. With my books ready, I'm getting my first endorsements. I put one of them on Twitter, actually, because I was so pleased with it. It's from a novelist friend, Marika Cobbold. I say friend, I actually only really know her through Twitter. She very kindly agreed to take a look and was very impressed. And I've got quite a few more coming in. So yeah, you never can tell with a book, but I think there are things in this one that might catch the public imagination. It certainly addresses things that are very much high on the agenda, both in the academic and the kind of mass media world. Issues of colonialism, race, war, empire. Interesting stuff, but in a fun way, I hope. Yeah, so that's still moving on. I've done some more interviews. I think next week will be Rory Keflin-Jones. Many of you may have heard of Rory. He is a former BBC technology correspondent. Lovely man. He wrote a fantastic book about his life. And the reason why it's appealed to me for this podcast is the story of his life is the story of a different age, an age that we've talked about before, 60s and 70s, where values were so very different. And in a sense, Rory's whole life was driven by, I shouldn't say scandal, more the fear of scandal, because he is basically the result of an affair, and an affair that couldn't really be acknowledged, and a relationship that couldn't really develop properly because of the social mores of the time and maybe also the people involved. And he had that extraordinary opportunity to kind of, after his mother died, he found loads of letters. I shouldn't give it all away, but he found loads of letters. He was able to reinvestigate his own life, using all his skills as a journalist to tell the story of his mother and his father and the times in which they lived. And it's very colourful and very moving and really interesting. So I'm so pleased that he's going to join me next week to talk about that. Actually, if he's currently better known for a book which is doing really well. He's written about adopting a rescue dog from Romania called Sophie from Romania, which is very entertaining. Half of my neighbours seem to be reading it. And I'll get him to talk about the dog, because everybody loves a good dog story. But the main focus will be on his own life. And I think you'll enjoy it. Other things coming up soon. Done my interview now about Lord Byron, his circle. I did that with Mock O'Keefe. He's going to be joining me as a guest host, probably in 2 weeks' time. And lots of other things bubbling. Now, what else is bubbling? Oh, I was thinking about the mugs. I love to sell a mug. There's a link to the shop in the bio. As ever, please like, please subscribe, please engage in the comments. But if you're thinking of a Christmas present and you know somebody who'd like a mug, because of the way it works, it's really easy for me to just sort of enter a name. So the mugs have funny slogans on. I think there's "I'm feeling scandalous," "You naughty girl," "You naughty boy," "Another day, another scandal." That's the most popular. But if you want one with your own name on it, or the name of a friend, I can do it really quite easily. So, Susan's feeling scandalous, or let's get scandalous tonight, David, or whatever you like, I can do it. And so I thought that might help shift a few more mugs and might put a couple more presents under the Craig family Christmas tree, along with the, bottles of vermouth and Angostura bitters. Thank you for watching. Please keep engaging, and I do appreciate your company. See you soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.